This hairdresser got the fright of her life when she wanted to cut this man's hair. The man went to his favorite hairdresser for a simple cut and styling, but soon the hairdresser started to cry out. Something was hiding in between his hair, something that absolutely did not belong there, and when they found out what it was, they had no choice but to call the police. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Pedro, 26, had an important appointment for work that day, so it was important for his hair to look perfect. A little trimming and touching up of my blonde color on top was what he wanted. Normally, no problem for owner Anna, but both Pedro and Anna could never have imagined what she found in his hair that day. It was a shock. She cheerfully grabbed her comb and scissors, but when she combed his hair to the side, she got startled. In a trembling voice, she shouted, "What the hell is this?" She quickly called her colleagues to come closer. "What's going on?" Pedro yelled to the staff present, who had now all gathered around his head. Fortunately for him, there was one hairdresser who did take some notice of her surroundings and wasn't just concerned with what was stuck on his head. She opened her mouth and said, "There's something stuck on your head that doesn't belong there, Pedro." She said it looked like a beetle. It was about 2 inches in size, but it sat perfectly still. Pedro was scared, but wanted to get the strange thing off his head as quickly as he could. Therefore, he decided to take action himself. He put his own hand through his hair, as the hairdressers clearly did not want to get their hands any closer to the animal. "Tell me when I'm close to it, okay?" Pedro slowly moved his trembling hand to the back of his head. "A little to the left, a little more to the back, and be careful," shouted the watching hairdressers. Pedro was as nervous as the startled women, but he was the one with the beetle on his head. "What is this disgusting thing?" he cried out loudly. Indeed, it looked very much like a beetle. "I don't think this is a beetle, ladies," Pedro said cautiously. The beetle felt cold and did not move at all. Even when Pedro gently pushed on it with his finger, there was no movement in the little thing. He asked the women who were scattered around him to take another good look, and then they saw it. It was the glint that caught their eye the most. Suddenly, they were no longer so afraid of the thing. This was indeed not a real insect. It was an object that made many want to have it, but how did it end up in Pedro's hair? "Then what is it?" Pedro asked one of the women. "This is a jewel," cried one of the hairdressers. "And not just any jewel. I think I know exactly where this one came from." Last week's newspaper was fished out of the paper bin and placed on a table in front of the group. "I knew it looked familiar," yelled the hairdresser. She pointed to the image on the front page. This was a rare jewel that had been stolen from the National Museum last week. A beetle formed from rare rubies. Only 9 had been made, and all 9 of these precious gems had been stolen last week. "But how does this one end up in your hair?" the hairdresser asked, slightly suspiciously. Pedro tried to remember where he had been for the past few days. Luckily, Pedro was able to answer this fairly quickly. In fact, he had not been home for the past few days. His house was being painted, and the painters had asked him if he could stay somewhere else for a few days while they did their work. Therefore, he had spent the past few days sleeping in a motel on the other side of town. He had been very busy with his work and therefore had barely left his motel room outside of some errands. So the jewel must have ended up in his hair during his stay there. As Pedro recounted this, the police were called up immediately. This was something that neither Pedro or any of the hairdressers could possibly solve. It was as if the police were already waiting for their call, because within 10 minutes they were in front of the barbershop. Pedro showed the glistening beetle to the officers and told them how they had discovered it. Even the agents, who were used to unique stories, couldn't believe their ears. One of the agents immediately said, "We're going straight to that motel right now, and you are going to help us." He went to the barber for a quick haircut, and now he was part of a major police investigation. He got into the back of the car and drove with the officers to the motel. When they were almost at the motel, one of the agents said the following. The officer turned to the back seat where Pedro was sitting and explained what was about to happen. He explained that 10 police cars would almost certainly alarm the thieves should they roam near the motel. That's why they would stay at a distance, and one man had to go inside. It was now up to Pedro to walk as normally as possible to the front desk. With a hidden microphone under his shirt and a little camera in his cap, he was directed to the motel reception desk. Pedro walked with heavy steps and was clearly nervous. But just before he went in, he took a moment and calmed himself. Nervously, Pedro walked through the doors of the reception desk. He was greeted kindly by the man at the front desk and given the key to his room. This man can't possibly be a jewel thief. Just look at him, Pedro thought. The owner and receptionist walked with him to the entrance of the front desk and kindly waved him off. Pedro could even see that the man had a hard time walking, so he didn't seem the person who would have launched such a daring heist. Yes, it was out of the question. He had to put his mind on somebody else, who was capable of such a thing and had access to his room. He arrived at his room and put the key in the lock. He tossed the entire room, but found nothing. Yet it would not be long before he found a huge loot in that same room. Pedro sat down on the edge of the bed and told the police that he couldn't remember either. The room seemed normal, and the receptionist couldn't possibly be the culprit. The man would sooner be a saint than a man with criminal intent. No, it had to be someone else. He decided to think out loud so that his words would also reach the officers who were waiting impatiently about 100 meters away. Who else has access to this room? Me, of course, the owner, receptionist, and beyond. Am I missing anyone else? Pedro was still in the middle of his thought process and did not notice that there was actually someone at his door at that very moment. His brain was hurting from thinking, but then there was a knock on the door. "Hello, cleaning! Room service!" was called from the other side of the door. "Of course, the cleaner," Pedro whispered into the microphone. "Nobody pays attention to these people, and they have unlimited access to all the rooms. A perfect cover-up for a jewel thief and lots of rooms to hide the treasure in," Pedro thought to himself. But that meant the thief was now outside his room, and they could just come in without permission. It was a woman. Pedro estimated her to be about 30 years old. She had long, wavy hair and at first a friendly-looking expression on her face. She walked into the room and saw the havoc Pedro had left behind. A normal cleaning lady would sigh deeply at this, but it was clear that this cleaning lady cared little for it. She walked directly to the one and only place Pedro had not yet searched, namely, the bed. She folded open the sheets neatly and covered the bed tightly, as if she were a real cleaner. But at the pillow, her attitude changed. She began to chuckle softly and turned the pillow on its side. What came out next was incredible. 8 identical beetle rubies rolled across the perfectly covered bedding. The woman only made the bed look perfect so her bounty had something comfy to fall on. Pedro let out a tentative cry, but fortunately managed to immediately slap a hand in front of his mouth. She wasn't supposed to hear him, but he had to pass this on to the police before the woman escaped. Code red, come quickly," he whispered as softly as he could. The woman counted up the rubies and seemed frustrated. She knew, of course, that there were 9 at first. She shook the pillow vigorously a few more times before she walked toward the door while grumbling with the rest of the rubies tucked safely away in the palm of her hands. "I have to stop her now before she runs off with the loot," Pedro thought. And on impulse, he jumped into the motel room. "Oh no, what now? I obviously haven't thought this through," Pedro spoke to himself. The thief looked up from the bed and was now face to face with Pedro. The two were in a face-off that resembles the old Western movies. If she had a weapon on her, this could be the end of him, but fortunately that was not the case. She turned as fast as she could and ran for the door. Pedro still tried to stop her by throwing soaps at her from the bathroom, but that slowed her down for a few seconds at most. The woman almost reached the doorknob. She knocked off the soaps and toilet blocks and opened the door to the outside. But then it happened. The delay Pedro had caused was just enough, for the agents who had just barely heard Pedro's whispered cry of distress had moved rapidly toward the motel. Were they going to make it in time? Or was this female burglar going to escape? And when the disguised thief opened the door, she immediately bumped into the hard chest of a few agents. "Now it's time for our big cleanup," Pedro heard one of the officers say, half laughing. The woman was arrested on the spot and would spend the next few years behind bars. The jewelry was returned to the museum, and Pedro, he got a reward he had absolutely not counted on. Check it out. In fact, the museum had promised a reward for the person who could give them the golden tip in the search for the rubies. an amount of no less than $25,000, and it didn't stop there. Because according to the museum, Pedro was not only the discoverer of the location, he was also the hero who put himself at risk to be able to help the agents. Therefore, the museum decided to give him an additional $10,000 for his heroic performance. Pedro was grateful and still had a hard time believing all of this had truly happened. But it did, and he was the shining centerpiece in solving this crime case. If he had just gotten a different room, or would have just chosen a different pillow to sleep on, that beetle would never have gotten stuck in his hair. Then his day would have been perfectly normal, and the thief would have been free with the precious loot. But sometimes things turn out the way they do. That's fate, Pedro exclaimed with a smile on his face.